essential freedoms that protect diversity in a plural society and the dignity of the individual. If state mistrust is the drafter of such policies, state interest is its publisher. These collaborating concepts work together to erode citizens' faith in the state, as well as citizen-to-citizen trust. The implication of such policies is division and fracture. Freedom of religion and belief is an issue that rests at the confluence of conflict between state interests and citizen rights. How do freedom of religion and respect for pluralism help resolve this great challenge? From 475 to 221 BCE, during the chaos of the Warring States era of the Qin dynasty, Taoism emerged. Taoism emerged, as did other Chinese folk religions, to promote harmony in nature, a concept which was diffused by the government-promoted concept of Wu Wei. Taoism acknowledges the unpredictable forces of nature and confers on its practitioners the wisdom to non-violently align the self with the natural world. In 400 CE, Buddhist monks penned the Golden Precepts to guide followers along a path to strengthen religious devotion. 10 precepts served as guides to maintaining inward and outward balance. The 9th offers a protocol for public conduct, urging followers to be compassionate and filial, and to nurture the good roots of non-contention. The 10th precept requires action achieved by living to benefit mankind. This applies to members of both state and society, as both actors are beneficiaries of nonviolence and tolerance. In 700 CE, the Tang Dynasty sat in the capital of Xi'an. Christian missionaries participated in court life and established the Church of the East. By the year 1000, followers of Islam were also noted contributors to trade and commerce during the Song Dynasty. Inclusion of a variety of religious communities contributed to the combined prosperity of all Chinese peoples. The aforementioned philosophies underscore the importance of respect for difference in a society composed of disparate, sometimes opposing ideas. In addition to social mores that provide for diversity, respect must be encoded in laws which protect equality and freedoms enforced by the state. These include freedom of expression, freedom of assembly and association, and freedom of religion. Yet centuries of complex religious and ethnic pluralism were eclipsed by the years under Mao, which placed traditional and emerging Chinese spiritualism and religious practice in contrast with national interest. Spiritualism and religious practice were put in conflict with the national interest in the Maoist era. These years eroded the common bond of trust among individuals and, by extension, among communities. Still, spiritual beliefs persisted. To overcome this crisis of trust, human rights must now be respected. Freedom of expression, association, and assembly are all interwoven with freedom of religion. Shared belief builds trust in communities, along with shared purpose, as communities learn to trust one another across ethnic, religious, and linguistic lines. This also enables a social environment conducive to pluralism and peaceful resolution of conflict. Over the course of the next few days, you will have many conversations that will cumulatively seek to answer the question of what benefit is belief to the Chinese nation. A lot of benefit. You will have discussions intended to shape reflection and thought on the role of diverse religious voices in one country, what it means to recognize freedom of religion, and why this is important for China. The timing of these discussions and their conclusions are deeply important for China today, given the intensified repression of a range of rights under current party leadership in China. First of all, consider that the protection of an individual's right to belief in itself increases trust. Where a plurality of faith and spiritual practices are recognized and protected, fear of persecution is eased. This also builds a sense of national community and strengthens the integrity of the nation as a whole. The state must therefore protect the right to practice belief and to express one's identity as a believer, and society must also. Today, the Chinese state monitors and manages belief, which increases suspicion of nonconformists who practice a faith outside the legally recognized religious institutions of China. Legally recognized institutions like the Buddhist Association of China, the Chinese Taoist Association, the Islamic Association of China, the Three Self-Patriotic Movement for Protestant Christianity, and the Chinese Patriotic Catholic Association. These are the only institutions sanctioned by the state, and their adherents are required to register with the government at the age of 18. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights jointly recognize the right of the individual to religion or belief. These provisions also recognize the necessity to protect the freedom to carry out one's belief in, quote, worship, observance, practice, and teaching. That is to say, in public. Han Buddhists in Guangdong publicly practiced their belief in a non-state temple and landed in criminal detention in the summer of 2014. 15 people were detained, and 18 today remain in prison. The local government security bureau charged them with forming and participating in a superstitious sect, secret societies, or weird religious organizations, which use superstition to undermine the implementation of the laws and administer rules and regulations of the state. A mouthful, but a sinister mouthful in the charge. Legal language is frequently used to smear independent religious groups. Such government propaganda affects people of all religions and encourages the public to turn away from others who are persecuted for their beliefs. Prominent human rights activists have also been charged with belonging to an evil cult, charged with separatism, and charged with inciting splitism. Such charges serve to divide the peoples of China along religious and ethnic lines. Falun Gong practitioners are particularly targeted. They are arbitrarily detained and are branded as members of evil cults. This sends a strong negative signal to the community as a whole, encouraging both government and societal repression. The Chinese government also cultivates community informants who report on religious practice and dissemination of study materials. Similar tactics are used to control the proliferation of Christian house churches. These actions are all symptoms of broken trust in society, broken trust by the government and society, and an effort to sow distrust in society of one another. As a prominent religious freedom advocate stated, quote, "I pursue the course I do, understanding that the bureaucratic ideology that dominates governmental action in China is causing more and more discontent among the people. As citizens are denied the right to be heard, and inevitably, this will lead to conflict between the people and the government. The equal acceptance of religious practices should be a common cause across the constellation of communities within the Chinese sphere of influence." It should protect their collective right to religious freedom, and by extension, the fundamental freedoms so closely associated with it. In contrast to the role of religion as a sustaining and guiding force in the life of the individual, the Chinese government sees religion as a tool to support the state. Today, atheism is the official party ideology. Religious practitioners are not allowed to join the party. In 2013, the director of China's State Administration for Religious Affairs stated that, quote, "The party has consistently emphasized that religious work is a key component of the party's united front, and religious people are important targets of such work." Well, the party certainly targets religious people, that's for sure, but not to unite them. Instead, the party has separated, the state has separated, fostered suspicion among them, and constrained them by their identities. In October of 2010, the UN Human Rights Council affirmed that all people have the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association, and that no one may be compelled to belong to an association. I just spent some time with the Special Rapporteur for freedom of assembly and association, both in Washington and in Arizona at conferences. The Chinese Communist Party's official policy on religion compels religious practitioners to acquire membership in a state organization in order to freely exercise their beliefs. This policy also prevents non-official religious institutions from assembling, lest they be labeled a cult or suffer consequences. There is clearly a conflict between international standards of freedom of association and CCP policy. Chinese Catholics are compelled to practice through the Patriotic Catholic Association, and the Chinese Communist Party forbids the presence of Vatican-appointed representatives in China. Catholics are often persecuted and treated as agents of foreign governments. As a result, they're often forced to go underground to practice their religion freely. There are an estimated 12 million Catholics in China today, most of whom are severed from the Vatican and compelled to participate in the Patriotic Catholic Association. State officials in Hebei province extracted fines from laypersons and arbitrarily detained priests in late 2014. When Bishop Peter Liu was appointed by the Holy See in 1997, he had to go underground for 17 years until his death. His burial was carried out secretly to protect his church members who feared arrest. Discrimination based on race and creed precludes minority engagement in activities that have the potential to improve the livelihood of all citizens, including not only spiritual fulfillment, but material livelihoods as well. And this is a key point in my remarks today. I'll return to it. Prior to the Reform era, capitalists were labeled evil and not compliant with party ideology. Business entrepreneurs could not officially join the Chinese Communist Party until 2001. The government changed this policy when it saw the public benefit of including people it had previously rejected. Today, atheism is the official party ideology. In many cases, individuals must sign a pledge to atheism during their application process. This denies pluralism in the public sector and marginalizes the openly faithful from participating in many aspects of social life and from contributing their talents, skills to local, regional, and national endeavors to increase prosperity. An opportunity, an asset for building prosperity is squandered. When will the Chinese government see all of these people as assets and hence see pluralism as fundamentally beneficial to China? Currently, the government extends invitations to some ethnic, religious minorities that pledge adherence to the party, but they must become channels for the state, co-opted to help maintain the optics of diversity, the mere optics of diversity. And they can't stand as independent advocates for unfettered pluralism. This relationship asymmetrically benefits the state and cleverly serves to further marginalize independent, ethnic, religious minority voices. For all manner of believers in China, the line between compliance and defiance is characterized by perfidious ambiguity at best. For instance, earlier this year in Zhejiang, government officials ordered the removal of crosses displayed on churches in Wenzhou, or China's Jerusalem, as local officials call it. 1 million of Wenzhou's 8 million inhabitants practice Christianity. Over the years, building permits for churches were awarded, but when Christian practice reached a certain public level, local party officials ordered their dismantling. The line, wherever it was drawn, had been crossed. Local party officials announced they would increase screening measures for membership in the party and the provinces and require written declarations of atheism to join the civil service. The line between compliance and defiance also exists in other realms of public life, inhabited by ethnic and religious minorities, and crossing over it can be dangerously destabilizing. Take the example of the Uyghur economics professor, Ilham Tohti, whose research and policy recommendations aim to build economic opportunity and to promote interethnic understanding in Xinjiang. Rather than embracing Tohti's pragmatic recommendations, the government sentenced him to life in prison in September of 2014 on charges of inciting separatism. Further, they detained, revoked travel rights, and/or rescinded scholarships of 8 of his students for advancing similar ideas. As for Tibet, the freedom to assemble in support of important religious and cultural leaders is essential to maintenance of peace at the community level. Police action increases the costs of the communities, as well as the government they represent. In the summer of 2014, troops moved to demobilize a community demonstration to release a detained religious and cultural leader in a Tibetan village near Sichuan border. Police fired live ammunition into the crowd, hitting 10 protesters. They later arrested 4 of those shot. Each of the arrested died within the week as a result of denied medical treatment. The government of China is inadvertently contributing to the very outcome that it fears most. By muzzling progressive forces from ethnic and religiously diverse communities, It provides a platform for the justification of extremism in response to its violations of religious freedom, freedom of expression, and freedom of association and assembly. The greatest irony may be that the government of China could best achieve its security goals by loosening, not tightening, its grip on religious practitioners and others in civil society. Simultaneously, we must work to support China's civil society. China's civil society in an effort to non-violently, from the bottom up, promote and protect religious tolerance, promote and protect pluralism, promote and protect diverse practice. Those elements serve as the crucial catalysts of people's agency, their recognition, their thriving, their prosperity, and their growth. In sum, these elements serve as catalysts for enlarging human dignity. Only when the Chinese state accedes to non-violent social demands for freedom of religion, assembly, association, and religion in the country will we see the genuine protection of all human rights in China. Only then will we see the genuine protection of economic rights and all other rights. Only then will China realize its potential to be a genuine force for good in the world. Only then will the Chinese people and Chinese government not live in fear of each other, and various communities not live in tension with one another. Only then will durable and veritable stability, one built on pluralism, be possible. Dialogue is a step in the right direction. This conference offers an important opportunity for dialogue on dignity, an opportunity that should be ongoing as a dialogue. I commend and Freedom House supports your efforts toward a more pluralistic, peaceful, and prosperous China, one built on interfaith and interethnic understanding. I welcome your questions and comments. Thanks for having me here.
Thank you, for your knowledgeable, informative, visional, and inspiring talk. All inclusive and comprehensive. Really impressive. Thank you very much. And I forgot to mention that Freedom House support this conference. So we're honored to have their support and honored to have their leader to be with us. Now we open for questions. Do you have any questions for Mr. Ligon? Bert.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. I agree with everything you said about what would be required for a new day in China. But my question is, how can we get the American people and through them the American government to more forcefully achieve that wonderful day, to speak out more publicly, persistently, and forcefully on human rights, including what you talked about in China, as it does to Mozambique or Liechtenstein?
It is a shame when China is considered such a large power that the United States, as a government, pulls back from speaking to its basic values. Freedom House published a report last autumn called Supporting Democracy Abroad, looking at 11 major democratic powers in the world and how committed they are to pushing for democratic norms beyond their borders. And in candor, despite the fact that Freedom House received funding from the US government, that report found that at times, all too often, the United States government pulls back from pressing for human rights based on strategic or economic interests it perceives having with China? It's an interesting question. I sat recently with some senior Senate staffers, and we asked the question, so should the United States try to engage in dialogue with China's leaders and have them see the errors of their ways? China's leaders listened to my little set of remarks today. They would have received a sermonette from me about how it's actually in your interest to allow pluralism. I'm not sure that my saying it, or even dialogue with the US government, is going to achieve it. But one can be certain that if the US government, American people, people of various faiths, don't raise this point, it will never be seen as both the right thing in terms of universal values and actually in the interests of China's stability. More pointedly, I do think people of faith, people of different religious practices, people who are agnostic and atheist who believe in these rights, they need to speak up. And the United States manages to get its foreign policy more oriented in the right direction when the people, when faith communities and the Congress raise up basic values and point out that actually it's in the United States' interests to push for those values. Other questions? Comment?
Sir, congratulations on a great speech. At the Human Rights Foundation, we're working on a comparative constitutional research project looking at incitement, the application of incitement, overly broad and vaguely worded incitement provisions to criminalize what should be and what would be in any democracy legitimate speech. Liu Xiaobo, the case of Liu Xiaobo comes to mind. He, I understand, is in jail on charges of inciting to overthrow the powers of the state. And you just mentioned a few cases on incitement to separatism. Do you see a trend by the Chinese dictatorship specifically in the use of incitement, overly broad incitement provisions to criminalize dissent?
Yeah, it is a trend, and of course, the actions of the Chinese government are not in a vacuum. The Chinese government is providing a playbook to other autocratic governments, and the Chinese government is informed by the methods of other autocratic governments as well. I'm a specialist on the UN and human rights debates in the UN, and there's been a significant debate in another realm about in the language of tolerance. Some have called for provisions in national law fighting against defamation of religion. We in the United States and in the West try to protect freedom of expression, and we see that the trigger for constraining freedom of expression is when violence or incitement to violence is involved. But that's a very convenient tool used by autocratic governments when they suggest that something is so offensive or so inciting that it needs to be stopped by state power. We should always lean in the direction of freedom of expression, freedom of thought. But I do think in the case of China, it's beginning to use those tools. It's an interesting thing, to put it in a broader perspective. Freedom House puts out an annual report on human rights and governance in the world, freedom in the world. We have found that in recent years and recent months, autocratic governments, notably China's, have been more brazen about their repression and less likely to invoke the language of democracy or the language of human rights. But this is still an example of using the trappings of what sounds like it's harmony building, but in fact is an instrument of repression. Others? And I'd welcome someone disagreeing with my premises or taking me on, or I don't pretend to be an expert in every faith tradition.
Hi. Did I stand up or do I just... Okay, I guess I agree with what you said about China and how to truly prosper it needs to acknowledge freedom of religion, and that will increase the trust between the people and the state. But it is in China's, I guess, to allow pluralism, it does undermine the whole idea of the communism, the party as the sole belief. So do you think it's impossible to have China continue as a communism state while allowing for pluralism to exist?
Well, I am somewhat pessimistic about the Chinese Communist leadership listening to my advice and taking it. It's a very convenient formula for the Chinese government to point to historical periods of division in China, to worry about Fisaporist tendencies, of splittist tendencies, to create the excuse, the pretext for a firm hand. But in a situation in which Marxist, Leninist, Mao Zedong thought is no longer the centerpiece of legitimacy of the state, and that economic growth is really the single form of legitimacy, there's going to have to be a thought process by China's leaders. Are they going to try and keep the white-knuckle grip? Or is there going to be a realization that in fact pluralism, and pluralism that goes far beyond the issues of Xinjiang and Tibet, but includes Xinjiang and Tibet, are they going to allow that pluralism to occur? Xi Jinping isn't going to. A recent study put out by Freedom House called The Politburo's Predicament suggests that of all things, there's a centralization of power by Xi Jinping, an individual probably with more influence than any single leader since Deng Xiaoping. And in that report, it looks at 17 different groups of different religious groups and professions and so on, and some, in particular, faith traditions or spiritual practices are among those who have seen, if anything, an increase in the pressure upon them.
I saw your hand.
Thank you for the talk.
Your name, and introduce yourself briefly.
Hi, my name is... Hello?
Hello. Hi. My name is Sapa, and I'm here for Students for Free Tibet. The report that you just mentioned, the Politburo's predicament, and also to a follow-up on the question about the U.S., what the U.S. government can do. In one of the recommendations in the report, it mentioned that a kind of a multilateral approach could be taken in terms of the U.S. not just speaking directly, but trying to form a coalition with other like-minded governments. And that's something that we are currently working towards, and I just wanted to ask, from Freedom House's perspective, what are some of those platforms or mechanisms that could be used, because it was a recommendation that I would ask that.
Well, there is a reason why in my short, not yet 4-month tenure as president of Freedom House that I have traveled to Ottawa and to Brussels and to Stockholm and to Oslo, among other places, to engage other powers in standing with the United States on some of these issues. Clearly, these issues need to be raised at the UN, and there is a great resistance to taking on China on human rights and religious freedom issues at the UN because it's such an influential power and, frankly, blackmails other countries, that their commercial relations with China will be harmed. Their investment benefits from China will be harmed if they stand up. I used to work in the U.S. government at a time when there were even resolutions on China specifically pursued in the UN. But the UN is not the only place that this should be raised. And I think one might call it a minilateralist approach rather than a multilateralist approach that the United States should work among great powers of the small d democratic world, and important for powers who are in East Asia, in the global South, to be among those who raise these questions. I will be delighted when the day comes that Brazil is not only talking about diversity within its own rich tapestry of society, but that it is boldly calling for diversity and pluralism in another rising power in the world, China.
Sorry.
Hi, my name is Yashui Cao. I'm the editor of ChinaChange.org. I've been pondering a question about what international non-profit NGOs can do. I was prompted by the recent 5 women's rights activists. We know that during this incident that the international LGBT community came out, women's rights NGOs came out, and this formidable campaign forced the Chinese government for the first time to release people they really want to hold. And there's no government statements and blah blah did this before. So I'm thinking this is a front we have to explore, especially you guys, like Freedom House, Human Rights Watch, and International Amnesty. I mean, it's wonderful. I mean, these organizations have a very little interest entwined with the Chinese government. That they don't care. I mean, they don't get money or they don't have trade relationships with China, and they can speak up. They can be in platform at UN and elsewhere. So I'm sorry, it's not really a question. It's just something to share with everyone.
Your ponderings and musings are rather similar to mine in the transition into becoming Freedom House's leader. I believe that there is no larger governance problem in the world than that in China. And while Freedom House has a responsibility to look at questions of human rights and governance all over the world, which we'll document and monitor, and we will naturally focus on the Middle East and North Africa with the twin problems of brittle dictatorships and terrorism, and also Russia and the mayhem it causes for the state causes for its own people and its neighbors. China is as important and more than any governance question, in large part because it is a model. It is a model for repressive tactics for other governments, and it offers a problematic model of economic growth with a lid placed on civil society and those of faith. Yes, international NGOs are in a special position. They have fewer moral dilemmas. They don't have the moral dilemmas of businesses or the moral dilemmas of governments that perceive some sort of strategic interests or economic interests, or even, sadly, the moral dilemmas of academics who would like to have access to visas to get into China. Now, I would hope all those other actors would act somewhat more principled, but international NGOs don't have that problem. They can speak up. I think the key is to see what works, and the example you raise of women or LGBT communities is important. If there's something else that I really believe deeply, in addition to the fact that Freedom House needs to focus a great deal on China, it is that women are agents of change, and that it will never be a mere fad or a passing interest for the political and economic empowerment of the majority in the world, females, to be important. And I have a suspicion that they will play an important role as agents of change. We need to make sure, as an international NGO, that we don't take away the agency and the innovation from those who are civil society actors on the ground. It's not our fight, it's their fight. But to say it's not our fight, it's their fight, is not to say that we're going to stand by. When they want help, we need to say we're for them, and we need to act systems.
Keith, next, Harry.
Thank you. 大家好，我的名字 Keith. I am I'm the new kid here, and here to as a new brother in this fight as well. But I want to piggyback on our esteemed colleague's question here about the fact that the change. How do you perceive change? From the bottom up or from the top down? Because in some of the most successful global campaigns, it's the people that really make the change. So the question is, again, how do we make our fights here, our unified fight, a common, a term that is common amongst everybody you walk down the street? Because let's face it, I can walk down the street and swing a dead cat and not hit anybody that understands Falun Gong, know even how to spell Uyghur or anything. So how do we make it mainstream so that the pressure comes from the bottom, and the bottom is what changes governments and government attitudes?
Well, some of us who are in the international human rights movement hear voices of pessimism. We're in a bit of a funk. Freedom House is Freedom in the World report has indicated for 9 years in a row more nations have moved in the wrong direction in terms of political and civil liberties than the right direction. And it's clear that autocratic governments are being canny in the way they manipulate social media and put pressure on civil society, closing the space for civil society. But we should not be glum. There is robust evidence that civil society can make change through nonviolent methods. And this is not just a kind of warm-hearted love of the model of Gandhi and the model of Nelson Mandela and the model of Martin Luther King. It works. The scholars, Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stepan, have studied conclusively that nonviolent means work to bring about change. And they work better than violent means. If you want to have change and the new political order to come to be consensual and pluralistic, then nonviolent means matter. So, but I can't predict what that spark might be that would unify all the different pluralist actors for a bottom-up effort at change. It may be labor unrest, it may be frustration with corruption, it may be in a sort of situation of Wild West growth in capitalism in China, a sense that there's a need for spiritual definition of what matters, and repression by the state of spiritual practice may be seen as insufferable. I don't know what the one spark will be, but encouraging nonviolent but active methods by civil society is the way. It is my view, despite my advice for the Chinese leadership of what would be in their own interests, that the change will happen from below.
Harry?
Henry DeGroot. I studied in Beijing last spring. So in your talk, you were talking about how perhaps pluralism is actually in the best interest of China in terms of meeting their state security needs. And I presume you're talking about, like, for example, pluralism would suppress kind of extremist violence, right? But isn't that extremist violence that comes from the repression of pluralism actually, doesn't it serve as a justification for further repression? And so really the security concerns are that, for example, to control the Tibetan water resources or Xinjiang, the flow of oil from Central Asia. And so when the security concern actually, they want extremist attacks in a sense?
This is a great question. And I just co-authored a blog on Freedom House's website with my good friend Rabia Kadir. and we talk about lessons to be learned about how the Chinese government has dealt with the Uyghur people. This is exactly the issue. Would not only China's future, but indeed the future of the current state, be served by not inciting this hatred and this demonizing as terrorists of any dissonant voice among the Uyghurs in Xinjiang? Yeah, I take your point. There is a degree to which the Chinese state seems to want to radicalize some Uyghurs so that there's an excuse for repression. This is the major takeaway, I would say, from the report the Freedom House put out on China and Xi Jinping's style of leadership, again, titled The Politburo's Predicament. It suggests that it is a double-edged sword to have such a repressive approach. If you put a lid on certain dissident voices in civil society, you control freedom of expression or freedom of worship. It might deter others who would come forward and resist the power of the state, but is it like a pressure cooker? Is it in fact increasing the chance that someday civil society as a whole will demand change, even in a way that overwhelms the military and police power of the state? Happy to talk about this further. Please keep in touch.
马永天。
你好，我是来自中国吉林省访民。那么呢，我今天所要谈的就是说，中国人权问题主要的还是体现在每个中国访民的个案，因为中国访民是不是在社会的最低层？现在可以说是饥寒交迫，从经济上、精神上各个方面都有一定的迫害。那么我不知道。作为美国或者是联合国还有国际社会各个组织，是否能够关心到这一块，或者是有什么意愿，或者是如何关注？谢谢。
I am glad to hear about petitioners concerned about forced evictions. Look, I will stop talking about things I'm proud of that Freedom House has done and commend our colleagues at Human Rights Watch, who a few years ago decided to put out a study that said, looked at the economic social rights protections by the Chinese state. The Chinese government has in many international bodies, for instance at the UN, said that economic and social rights need to come before political and civil liberties. And this canny report from Human Rights Watch points out that even by their own standards, economic and social rights are not well protected. Land eviction is a basic violation of people's access to justice. It is good that there are petitioners. Hopefully that will grow into a voice that cannot be resisted. But the international community should think about this. It is important to not only raise some of the most obvious cases of free expression, free assembly, and freedom of conscience, but those issues of a forced eviction as well. Worldwide, we see those whose land rights are trampled upon by the state or by majority populations. There is no real access to justice if people lose this basic stake as a small economic actor. Your land is taken from you. It is merely rights on paper or in laws or in treaties that have been ratified that are not at all implemented and realized in practice if basic land rights aren't protected.
So among us are quite a few petitioners on the issue of land rights forced eviction, and we want to recognize them. Some of them come from China. Li Huanjun, is she here? And Li Meiqing, Yang Shuangjun, and other 这个就是访民关于这个 这个失去土地和被强迫拆迁的。Okay, you have a question? Yeah.
Thank you so much for that insightful speech. Among the 2016 White House hopefuls, which one do you think are most likely to return to the human rights focused foreign policy? Is it possible to form a coalition led by Freedom House that facilitate that, prepare those candidates?
Yes.
Facilitate, that change. Thank you.
Freedom House is a ruthlessly nonpartisan organization. I hope those of you who know me, that even though I served in offices related to one party in the U.S. political system, the thing I am most associated with is working in alliances with people with different views, people who are secular, of faith, left and right. Freedom House will try and play a role in the debate in the presidential season. We're getting together with our friends at Human Rights First and Humanity United, talking about sponsoring fora to insist that all presidential candidates of both parties emphasize these issues of human rights. Who will be the best? I'm not going to speak to that. But I do think that there is reason to think that candidates of either party will move things in the right direction.
Dr. Larkin, Radio Free Asia, Gregory Ho. Please allow me to ask a very provocative question. Since you mentioned before that the essence of non-violent protest, but this is 10 years of this kind of forum, and many regions, including Hong Kong, Tibet, and the Uyghurs, they feel really fed up with the current forms of resistance. So, are there any justification of limited violence protests? Even a little, just a little bit, maybe violence, limited violence. Well, I'm not sure.
A personal story will not necessarily be exciting to the listeners of Radio Free Asia, but I come to Freedom House after having been professor for 4 or 5 years at Georgetown, and I taught a course on ethics, and there's a good question: when is violence justified? When the African National Congress and a wing of it in South Africa felt that some violence made sense under an apartheid regime, there's a moral dilemma there. I'm not going to endorse violent methods. I think that nonviolent methods are, the justified way to go in China, but I understand how some may become fed up. I think it's important for those who are outside, the U.S. government, the people of the United States, the people of countries around the world, international NGOs, show solidarity for those who would pursue nonviolent means, so that they know that in the end, the arc of history really will bend towards justice, even when they suspect it doesn't seem to be bending their way.
One last question. 夏律师。
我是中国的维权律师，对不起，我不会讲英文讲得不好。中国呢，这个土地啊，这个官员贪官们呐，强拆房屋强征土地，造成了很多侵占了就是老百姓的财产另外呢，还有宗教迫害我是维权律师，我们中国有很多律师现在起来帮助这些受迫害的人去维权。维权呢，律师也受到迫害中国呢，我们是依法维权，用政府共产党制定的法律来说，你为什么不执行你制定的法律？结果呢，我们律师也遭到迫害，他们的法律是形同虚设的然后呢，在这种情况下呢，我想美国的这个法律师们司法机构能不能给我们中国的律师提供一些什么样的帮助这是我有这么个愿望。
It's very important for a legal culture and capacity to develop in China to look out for those whose human rights have been abridged. We know that lawyers are under pressure in China if they stand up for those who are having their rights abridged. Lawyers from the outside should be helpful. I have been struck by some who have been oriented towards dialogue with the Chinese government and training on rule of law, have been alarmed by the degree to which lawyers are put under pressure. My colleague Jerome Cohen is an example of just such a figure, growing more alarmed. We need to help. And we need to quietly assist those, not just human rights defenders who are being squeezed, but those lawyers who would stand up for them. And I'm happy to quietly, not here in a public forum, talk further about ways that we could do that.
I overlooked your hand. Sorry, I give you a chance. It's the last one. Absolutely last one.
My name is Han Biao, a scholar and human rights lawyer from China. I have a question related to Dr. Haiyanzhou and others. You know, China is very skilled in manipulating international human rights mechanisms. For example, the UPR, the Human Rights Council, for example, the human rights or rule of law dialogue between China and other countries. But in general, it seems it doesn't work. So my question is, do you think is it necessary to reconsider the strategy of the international community and the human rights organizations to deal with human rights issues?
You know, the Chinese government is very canny. It uses multilateral fora. It uses dialogue. But I submit to you that the international community should be able to be as canny, surely more principled, and offer more solidarity than the Chinese government can. It's the mistake of a Western government to think that dialogue should be an end in itself. If you have a human rights dialogue with China, it may be productive, but if you make the dialogue the goal rather than a means to something, it's a mistake. We should continue to try and use multilateral fora. In general, the Universal Periodic Review is a useful tool to give breathing space to civil society organizations to call to account their governments. I think we should use those spaces more. It may seem like it's a fool's errand to try and use the UN to confront a very powerful state that sits on the UN Security Council and has economic relationships with all sorts of nations of the Global South and the Global North. But we need to continue to do that. For there to be any integrity of multilateral organizations, there needs to be an effort to raise how one of the largest human rights abusers in the world, the largest human rights abuser in terms of population, is conducting itself. But I'd be happy to talk about specifics later. Thank you for what you are here this week to do. And I especially thank you for thinking that I might help seed some of your thinking with an